Welcome to this PhD defense. My name is Birte Holst-Jørgensen and I'm Deputy Head of Department. I want to welcome the examiners, Visiting Associate Professor Catherine Vincent from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, Senior Researcher Mikkel Funder, Danish Institute of International Studies, and Senior Researcher Karen Holt from the DTU Partnership, and Karen is chairing the Assessment Committee. I also want to welcome you, Caroline Schaer, the PhD candidate, and also one of the supervisors, Associate Professor Erik Komlavi Arhonu from Roskilde University. And of course, welcome to all of you that have taken your way to the UN city to listen to the PhD defense. Caroline will make her defense on a thesis called Governance and Community Responses to Floods in Poor Peri-Urban Areas, the case of urban disaster reduction and climate change adaptation in Pikine in Senegal. And first, Caroline will make a presentation of her thesis around 45 minutes, more or less. If not, I will say so. And then we will have a short break. And during the break, you are welcome to notify me if you have some questions to our PhD candidate. Otherwise, the assessment committee will grill her a little bit for no longer than 2 hours. But normally it will not take so long time. So first, Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, welcome. It's nice to see so many of you here in spite of the autumn holidays. During the next 45 minutes, I will take you through my PhD dissertation. So the title of my PhD is Governance, as was just told before, Governance and Community Responses to Floods in Poor Peri-Urban Areas, the case of urban disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in Pikine, Senegal. I will take you through the objectives and the research questions of my PhD, followed by the rationale for the choice of research area, the research design and methodology. I will then take you through the analytical framework, followed by the 3 articles that I have produced, and I will finish with the contributions and the implications for future research. So starting with the objective of my PhD, the overall objective is to explore the governance of urban disaster risk management and climate change adaptation and related public services in a context of weak state capacity. So in order to live up to this objective, I have formulated a main research question, which is how is the governance of flood management configured at the national and local levels in underserviced peri-urban areas in Senegal, and what are the consequences of such configuration? And in order to answer the main research question, I have formulated 3 sub-research questions. The first being, how have urban floods been managed in Senegal, and why has this management not led to the results expected by the population? And this question is addressed in the first article, which is under review in the Climate and Development Journal. It was written with the Mamdemba Cham from IFAN in Dakar and Ivan Nygaard here from UDP. The second research question asks, how is urban flood management configured locally in the absence of adequate public services, infrastructure, and protective regulations, and what are the consequences of such configuration? This question is addressed in the second article, which has been accepted in the Progress in Development Studies journal, and it was written with Erik Komlavi from RUC. The last research question asks, how do poor urban dwellers cope with and adapt to perennial floods in a context of weak state capacity, and are local coping strategies a stepping stone towards adaptation, or are they on the contrary likely to lead to maladaptation? And this is addressed in the third and last article. It has just been published in the International Journal of Climate Strategies and Management. So just to illustrate this differently, the relationship between these different questions and articles. The first article explores the institutional framework for disaster risk reduction and flood management and main interventions at the national level in Senegal. And it also looks at the influencing factor for the limited accomplishments within the domain of flood management. Going from the national level to the municipal level, I will look at the configuration of municipal governance, of flood response service delivery, and the implications of this governance in the municipalities of Guinaw-Rail-Nord and Dalifort. And lastly, the last article goes to the local household level and looks at local coping and adaptation strategies and the risks of maladaptation. So going now to the rationale for the choice of research subject. By 2020, between 75 and 250 million people in the world are projected to be exposed to an increased water stress due to climate change. At the same time, more than 1 billion people in the world live in overcrowded settings without access to water, sanitation, and often without the security of tenure. This number is expected to double to 2 billion by 2050. In Africa, it is estimated that 72% of the urban population lives under slum conditions. So the urban poor bear disproportionate burden of climate impacts because of multiple vulnerabilities. And they are normally the most vulnerable to adverse climate events because of poverty, because of inequality, because of inadequate social services and infrastructure, social fragmentation, etc. So there has until recently been a lack of attention to climate change and vulnerability in urban contexts by governments, by scientists, and by the international donor community. For example, urban funding strategies have been slow to develop, and indicators have also sometimes been ill-suited to urban contexts. There is limited research on the role of climate change adaptation and disaster risk management government systems and institutions, and therefore there's an express need to widen the adaptation focus beyond these technical and infrastructure options in order to address institutional and social dimensions as well. And there's also little empirical work on how the state is translated locally and how services are produced in context of weak state capacity. And this is even more so the case in the context of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction related services. Going from the rationale to the research design and methodology, I have applied a grounded theory approach to my work. Central to the grounded theories approach is the generation of concepts, which is driving the research process and which may be seen as general ideas that are supporting this research process. So grounded theory in its pure form has been criticized for being unrealistic in its assumption that data may be approached from a theory-neutral perspective, based on the idea that concepts are inherent in the data and that they're awaiting the researcher's discovery. So it is true that I did not enter the field with an entirely open mind, since I could not suspend my awareness of theories, my earlier experiences, and therefore, instead of a grounded theory approach in its pure form, I applied the more recent constructivistic position to grounded theory, where categories and concepts are found to emerge from the researcher's interaction with the field. So in this sense, my observations from the field are influenced by theory, but they're not theory neutral or theory determined. So the process I followed for analyzing data was not purely inductive or deductive, but it was a combination of both, where theoretical questions of a deductive nature helped me analyze critical areas of inquiry, and where research questions of an inductive nature helped me analyze concrete dynamics. So I followed an iterative strategy for linking theory and data, going back and forth between the theory and the data, and thereby also slowly sharpening my concepts. And this was made possible through an ongoing process of coding, where I used in vivo software for qualitative analysis, and this coding process meant that categories and concepts emerged through an open coding and selective coding process. So going to the case study, the ethnographic fieldwork is based on an in-depth and explorative case study approach. In-depth case studies may contribute with new knowledge development through through what is called analytical generalizability, also called theoretical generalization, which means that my findings, the question is not really whether my findings can be generalized to a wider universe, but how well concepts and theories may emerge from the findings. An in-depth case study may also contribute with knowledge development by looking at how well the case resonates with other cases in different contexts or in different times. So going now to the case study area, I conducted my work in 2 municipalities of Pekin, which is an area of 900,000. Pekin is an area of 9,000 inhabitants, and I conducted my work in the municipality of Dalifort and Guinaw Nord. So these zones are considered as neither rural or urban, but as a combination of both. They developed without any urban planning, and they are the most densely occupied areas of the country, with a surface occupation of 43%. So the areas developed from the 50s as a result of an administrative decision to evict residents from the irregular neighborhoods of the Dakar city center, a process that is called déguerpissement in a West African context. And they also developed as a result of an extensive rural-urban migration after extensive droughts in the 1970s. So people settled down in this area without any urban planning and under what is by the authorities termed the occupation irrégulière of the land, which is the irregular occupation of the land, which was based on parallel land ownership arrangements based on customary law. So the first inhabitants of the municipalities, typically the chef de quartier, the neighborhood chief, sold the parcels to newcomers. Today, tenure arrangements are quite blurred. Some are based on customary law, and some have received a 50 years right of occupation. The zones are characterized by informal economy, high unemployment rates, by primitive shacks and brick houses, and critical infrastructure such as waste management, water, sanitation is very poor and often even non-existent. So these zones have experienced recurrent floods the last 15 years, and these floods have had varying impacts and durations. Just to give you an idea of the extent of these floods, in 2009 it was 500,000 people who were affected by floods, and in 2011 650,000 people, and this is for Dakar and Pekin. So the reasons for floods in these areas are quite complex, and they're due to both natural and human factors. First of all, floods are due to increases in volume and intensity of rainfall due to climate change, but they're also due to an anarchic and rapid urbanization process which has reduced the permeability of ground surfaces and thereby also increased runoff rates. As we see on this image here, this is the Niayes area in Pekin, and it's an area which consists of dunes and depressions. This picture is from 1942, so we can see that there are no constructions here. If we compare with a picture from 2005, you can see the difference, how the city has expanded to this area. Roads have been constructed on parts of these depressions, which is also obstructing the natural drainage, the natural evacuation of water. Floods also due to insufficient or non-existent rainwater drainage, near-surface water table conditions, and poor or absent sanitation networks. So The impacts of floods in these areas have been quite devastating for the populations, ranging from deaths, illnesses, water pollution, the loss of earning, damages to buildings and infrastructure, family fragmentation, the destruction of mosques and markets, etc. Going now to the data collection process. My data consists of secondary data, consisting of books, grey literature, scientific articles, of course, policy statements, press articles. And it consists on in-depth qualitative interviews. I conducted 93 interviews at the local level with households, with municipal actors, with the neighborhood chiefs, community organizations, business owners, etc. I also conducted 20 interviews at the national level with ministries, with other public and semi-public institutions, with experts and international organizations. I conducted 7 focus group sessions which were based on participatory diagramming methods, as you can see on some of these pictures. And my data also consists of observations, informal conversations. I attended neighborhood committee meetings and municipal workshops. So going now to the analytical framework. My work has been inspired by the anthropology of public spaces and public action. Although the lack of capacity of the state in Africa to exert authority and offer public services has been discussed and explored extensively, very little work has been focused on an empirical understanding of the functioning of state institutions. There has been little attention to the civil servants who operate within and in the name of the state, and few empirical studies of public service delivery have been undertaken. So research on state building and public services has mainly been conducted within the field of political science, where the focus has often been on characterizing the African state. If we take the state failure paradigm, for example, here the functioning of the state and the bureaucracy has mainly been explained through concepts relative to its cultural environment, where ethnicity, kinship, patron-client relationships, for example, have explained the failures of the state. They're found to undermine political institutions and bureaucratic structures. So here, the focus is on the state as an entity, as opposed to a set of social processes, and it is concerned mainly with the theories of the state rather than the empirical analysis. So this means that it generalizes a wide range of issues. It doesn't take into account the many institutions which actually exercise governance in an African context. It doesn't take into account the effects of development assistance or the changes experienced by African traditions. So the point here is not that the state in Africa may not be influenced by, say, patron-client relationships. The point is that governance cannot be generalized upon or compared to normative ideal, but that it should be analyzed through an explorative and an empirical approach. So, so the anthropology of public spaces and public action acknowledges that the lack of state capacity does not necessarily devoid, but has resulted in the negotiated character of public service delivery between state and non-state actors, where the practice of governance varies from place to place. And this underlines the need for a context-specific understanding of governance. So, state institutions should be analyzed through the many formal and informal actors in the field of public authority and the complex negotiating processes between them. The modes of governance which are officially involved in the delivery of public services, such as the state, the municipalities, and the local organizations, all face difficulties in terms of financial capacity, human resources, and work organizations. And these bottlenecks are circumvented through what Olivier de Sardon calls palliative forms of governance, where public services are governed by different combinations of statal, associative, individual, entrepreneurial, and aid-driven forms. And these together constitute the concept of real governance. So real governance is thereby composed of a set of complex social processes among actors and groups, which are negotiated and shaped in the street, in the market, in the press, and in the official public decision-making arenas of community and local government. So you can say that actors are in this sense all involved in doing the state. Because of the inconsistency between the official norms of the state and public services and the practical and the actual practices of civil servants and users, it is found that official norms do not guide the behavior of actors alone, but they are accompanied by social norms, which are the morally accepted modus operandi, and practical norms, which are the informal rules of the game. And practical norm may be complementary to official norms, but they may also be bypassing or even be contradictory to official norms. And thereby they are key to understanding real governance. So in this sense, the distinction between state and civil society, between public, private, formal, informal, is no longer valid because informality is not viewed in opposition to the state, but the state is instead a place of informality where practices are not necessarily told or written, but they are regulated through common routines. So I hope you're still with me, because now we are going to the articles. The first article, entitled Flood Management in Urban Senegal, an actor-oriented perspective on national and transnational adaptation interventions. The context is that numerous flood adaptation and mitigation interventions have been, and policies have been implemented the last 15 years. These have aimed at flood prevention, relief, support to recovery, and long-term adaptation. So there has been an abundance of funds flowing in the country and the presence of numerous bilateral and multilateral agencies and NGOs. So while these interventions have multiplied, the results have continued to be disappointing. There has been a relative increase in flood victims and in the vulnerability of the urban populations. And floods have still devastating impacts on urban dwellers. So the article seeks to address why this is the case. And while there may be many reasons for this, I have analyzed the institutional framework for disaster risk reduction, the main interventions and policies implemented the last 15 years in the country, and I have sought to address this question by adopting an actor-oriented perspective, also called, or the similar perspective, entangled social logics approach. So central to this approach is the critical view of the linear and rational thinking behind ideal type interventions, according to which problems may be identified, followed by appropriate actions which are leading to predictable outcomes, as for example exemplified in the logical framework approach. According to this approach, development interventions should be seen as being part of ongoing socially constructed and negotiated processes where actors have diverging interests and motives, and where the unintended consequences are sometimes more important than the intended ones. So the assumption is that there is no clear separation line between external aid and endogenous resources, because public authority is no longer the sole capacity of the state, but it's influenced by many actors, including donors, especially after the Paris Declaration with, for example, the application of direct budget support. So the constant political and social struggle between actors create arenas for struggle over issues, over symbolic and material resources. The existence of these arenas suggests that interventions are used by actors to serve diverse interests and priorities, such as, for example, strengthening political or professional positions, social networks, etc. So the analytical concept of ARENA is found appropriate because it marks the understanding of flood management interventions as political and social in nature. So going to the findings, the analysis points toward 3 key findings. First, the analysis finds that the political and personal appropriation of flood response is significant in the country. And this is visible through momentary period of symbolic activity in the arena of national politics. These symbolic acts were all linked to major flood events, and they were presented as a will from the government to help the disaster-stricken populations. But it is found that they were also highly a way to use a symbolic disaster response in order to hold on to political power, weaken the opposition, and channel funding. An example of this is the Plan Schaer, which was a much promoted rehousing program initiated by the former government under President Wade after devastating floods in 2005. And the president decided to postpone elections in order to divert the funds to help the flood-affected victims by building 400 new houses under what came to be known as the Cité Schaer. So in reality, this was also seen as a pretext to postpone elections to collect significant fundings, while at the same time making the government's commitment to solve the flooding issue visible prior to elections. In reality, the program reached a very small percentage of those affected by floods. It was technically poorly conceived because the Cité Schaer itself experienced floods afterwards. So they moved people from one flooded area to the next. And it was also under criticism for the misuse of funds. Just going to take some. It's found that there has been a competition for donor funding where institutions headed by the opposition coalition have been excluded to access and control external funds. So it's found that this has created an environment where interventions are in deficit of legitimacy, characterized by rumors, suspicion, accusation, and apathy. And some actors have even gone as far as to call it a flooding industry. Going to the second point, it's found that the dichotomy between central government and municipalities is also found to play a role. Party political interference from central government in the management of municipal affairs has been practiced by several governments. In the context of flood management, the responsibility for floods, for addressing impacts, and for channeling funding has been an ongoing issue of conflict. In 2009, the BSS opposition coalition won the municipal elections in the major cities affected by floods in the country. And this was seen as a result of the popular discontent with the Plan Schaer and with the way that the government had been dealing with floods. And this had dramatic consequences for flood management because the government decided to decentralize the responsibility for flood management to municipalities without allocating any new funding. And this means that the governmental resources earmarked for municipalities were already inadequate, and of course they were less than sufficient for municipalities to actually play a role in terms of flood management. So this was really seen as a penalty imposed on the major cities run by the opposition. It's found that aid rarely trickled down to the municipal level. So opposition parties entering office at the municipal level are found to be a threat to flood response delivery. Going now to the third and last finding, institutional fragmentation and overlaps are also found to explain part of the reason why there has been limited accomplishment within this field. In spite of the existing coordinating mechanisms and institutions in place, policies and plans have been formulated in isolation without a concerted government vision. It's found that the coordination of flood management takes place within the respective sectors, while the coordinating mechanisms in place do not really play their intended role. The high level of donor support that the country has enjoyed with respect to flood response has fueled this piling up of institutions, where new institutions are put in place, sometimes at the request of development partners, without old ones being dissolved, and often with a very short lifetime. So just to give you an example, between 1999 and 2009, 8 different coordinating mechanisms for flood management have been put in place. While some of these were never operational, many of these have also been functional, at least on paper, at the same time. So we see institutions with overlapping mandates and scattered prerogatives with different layers of influence and legitimacy. And this has created inertia at the highest political level without having binding documents and clear mandates within the domain. So this was for the first article. Going now to the second article, entitled "The Real Governance of Flooding Response in Peri-Urban Senegal, Co-Production, Inequity and Active Citizenship." So the article explores the configuration of municipal flood management governance and implications in the municipality of Guinaw-Rail Nord. Local municipalities are expected to play an essential role with respect to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, because key areas of services such as waste management, sanitation, urban development have been decentralized from the central government to the local municipalities. And as I said before, this decentralization has not been followed by an actual fiscal decentralization. So local municipalities are characterized by the lack of financial and human capacity and weak coordination. So the question that arises is whether this has resulted in non-decision making for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. If we take the example of Guinaw-Rail Nord, the two governmental resources earmarked for municipalities, which I have translated to the Decentralization Fund and the Local Communities Fund, are allocated to municipalities on an ad hoc basis. And to give you an example, in 2012, this amounted to $115,000 to the municipality for a population of 36,000 people. So this shows really the limited resources available. Out of this budget, there's no clear budget allocated directly to flood management, but it's taken out of the budget for the environment, and it amounts to between $7,000 and $9,000 on a yearly basis that is allocated to flood management, which is pretty much nothing. So, sorry, I'm a bit too fast here. So with a very simplified illustration, I will try to show you how the governance of flood response is configured in a context of very limited resources. So within this limited budget, the municipality has set up a flood management committee, which is supposed to coordinate the flood response. So it's supposed to help prevent floods, but also to help with relief and everything around flood response. This committee is also composed of subcommittees, but these are not functional. So it is presided by this municipal actor, which I have, for the sake of this case, called MM. He's also a municipal councillor, and he works on a voluntary basis, but he also receives some allowances by the municipality. So because of the very almost inexistent resources available to him, he is assisted in his work through different networks that he's part of, different kind of arrangements with different kinds of actors. And these are both based on a voluntary basis, but they also involved some kind of under-the-table payments. So this includes, for example, the fire brigade, the local and external dahiras, which are religious associations based on their shared loyalty to a common marabout, which is a religious leader. Youth and sports associations are also involved. The chef de quartier, the neighborhood chiefs, the imam, the neighborhood committees. We see the umbrella organization for all community-based organizations, the private sponsors, the volunteers, and NGOs are also present and involved, as well as the private sector. So through these different networks and arrangements, he's able to deliver different kind of services related to floods. And these include the digging of temporary channels for water evacuation, the cleaning of evacuation channels, the provision of water pumps, the cleaning of these retention basins, the evacuation of households, emptying septic tanks, the coordination of relief, the provision of gasoline, information sharing. He's also involved in the resolving conflicts that arise around floods, and also the practice of backfilling that I will return to afterwards, but it's a practice where the houses and yards are filled up with gravel and sand in order for households to stay safe from the floods. It's a practice that is discouraged by the government and by experts because of its unsustainability and its negative effects for the community as a whole. So this case illustrates several aspects of the real governance of flooding in this municipality. It shows that the lack of resources and efficiency of state institutions has not resulted in a vacuum, but that many different actors have entered the field of public service delivery. Although they are mainly non-governmental and often spontaneous, informal responses to floods are nonetheless relatively organized according to locally developed governance logics. We see that palliative forms of governance are applied, where public services are governed by different combinations of statal, associative, individual, and aid-driven forms. So we see that the formal structures which are supposed to guide this municipal actors' action do not really come to play as they're meant to. Instead of public institutions being mobilized according to legal texts and formal procedures, we see that services are co-produced between service providers and service users. So this shows the prevalence, the existence of informal, unintended privatization of public services, and it also shows that state institutions are being privatized as much by own agents as by users. So despite the limited efficacy of these practices, it shows that informal, unintended privatization allows the delivery of a certain service. So because of the personalization of the service, we see that this municipal actor, navigates across different kinds of networks in order to get the support he needs to fulfill his role. So in this way, he takes ownership of some of the central processes related to flood management, and this allows him to function as a broker for flood-related services. And this is possible because of different normative orders in his environment. We see that the official rules that are recognized by the state, that are defined in legal texts and municipal decrees, that stipulate the official responsibility for disaster relief and urban planning management, we see that they are rarely translated in the everyday lives of the population. And therefore, we see that different norms, local norms, coexist with these official norms. One example of a practical norm is the use of backfilling, because this activity is illegal by reference to official norms, but it's also highly legitimate by reference to practical norms. We see that public authority is negotiated through the many networks that this agent is part of, and not based on his official function of municipal actors. Therefore, we see different kinds of accountabilities that are at play. We see bureaucratic accountability towards the municipality, representational towards, for example, the community groups, reputational towards the Muslim Brotherhood, and financial towards NGOs. So because of these many layers of governance and accountabilities, there is no real consensus on what may be seen as legitimate practices. And therefore, the nature, quality, and coverage of public services depend on the outcome of these different negotiation processes. And it's found that this has different implications. In Guinea Nord, the most vulnerable segments of the population have more difficult access to these services because they are often found outside of these negotiation processes. So because they have less access to the local networks, they have also more restricted access to the flood-related services. But the case also shows that the case not only shows the co-production of services between different actors, it also shows new expressions of active citizenship by redefining the implicit social contract between citizen and state. So we see that residents address the bottlenecks of service provision by partly taking it into their own hands. And we can say that the services that are provided are far from perfect, but at the same time, by relying on their own forces and by going against the rules, they're also claiming their rights to inhabit these zones. So this was it for the second article. Going to the third and last article, entitled Condemned to Live with One's Feet in Water, a case study of community-based strategies and urban maladaptation in flood-prone Pekin, Senegal. So just to remind you, the objective was to characterize local coping and adaptation strategies and to look at their susceptibility to be maladaptive. Maladaptation is defined as business as usual development, which by overlooking climate change impacts inadvertently increases exposure and or vulnerability to climate change. And it's also seen as action undertaken to adapt to climate change impacts that do not succeed in reducing vulnerability, but which increase it instead. So maladaptation may arise when there's an increased emission of greenhouse gases, high opportunity costs, when activities have negative impacts for future generations, or undesirable impacts on the most vulnerable households, and when they reduce incentives to adapt. Out of these, it is the last three pathways through which maladaptation arises that I have applied in my work. So what I have done is that I have identified and classified coping and adaptation strategies adopted locally by situating them according to a temporal scale, according to which actors are at play, and the forms of strategies, whether they are social, economic, physical, etc. So I won't go into detail, but this is just to show you that there are many different kinds of strategies applied locally. To give you a few examples, we have savings as an economic anticipatory strategy. We have the creation of flood committees. People are also flood-proofing their houses through different rudimentary improvements, such as building small walls or paving their floors. We also see the digging of temporary channels, and this is how it looks 4 months after the floods. So when the channels are not filled up with sand again after the floods, it constitutes health and security risk, and at worst cases also erosion. We see the construction of rudimentary pipe construction for water evacuation, the selling of assets, the use of backfilling that I mentioned before. So here you can really see what happens when people elevate the yards with sand. It looks like houses are sinking in the sand, some people calling the urban alternative to houses on stilts. And you can see that people have difficulty standing up in their house, and because of this practice, 42% of the houses of the municipality are actually abandoned. people who have some financial means, as you can see on the last picture, they heighten the walls in order to compensate for the lost spaces. So this means that it's actually building floors. Yeah, there are many levels under the sand. The last practice is the construction of water retention basins, paving, and also the construction of open evacuation channels, which are also criticized for posing security and health risks. So we can see that in spite of their limited resources, the urban poor are not passive victims of floods, but they are applying a wide range of collective and individual strategies in order to prevent floods, in order to withstand the impacts, and also in order to adapt. However, most of these strategies are focused on the immediate response and relief phase. We see that the capacity of urban dwellers to cope and adapt is exhausted by previous floods, which means that they're caught in these vicious circles of increased vulnerability and risks. We also see that present coping and adaptation capacity is determined by past maladaptation, by people moving to these flood-prone places in the first place, and then maladaptation has been reproduced at lower scales. So we see that community-based strategies are maladaptive by diverting risks in time and space and by having negative implications for the most vulnerable population groups. So finally, and logically, from the findings, community-based strategies do not compensate for the lack of services and infrastructure. And finishing now with the contributions of my research. My research has contributed with the application of anthropological governance theory to flood management, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction at local levels. Also with the analytical and empirical insights on the political drivers behind national disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and also with empirical advancements on the functioning of local and meso-level institutions for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So, in terms of future directions for research, it could be interesting, as was recommended, to look at a cross-cutting analysis of the findings at various levels, for example, by looking at the implications of multi-layered governance for policy making. Also to apply this analytical framework to these kinds of problematics in different contexts, and also to explore the concept of active citizenship and public services in peri-urban areas, and to explore the implications of specific combinations of governance modes for service users. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.